Good morning. It's great to be here today. And today I want to talk to you about how the theme of risk runs through the decision to call the referendum, the campaign, and its aftermath like words through a stick of rock. I'll explain why David Cameron took the risk of his life, how the Remain and Leave campaigns attempted to leverage the concept of risk in the bloodiest and bitterest political fight since World War II, and finally the risk to you and the country at this volatile and uncertain time. So as John said, I was never really involved in politics. I basically became the editor of the BBC News at 6 and 10. Then, as he said, I went on to run the World Service. I did the 2010 general election campaign for the BBC, little knowing that a year later I'd be working for David Cameron. And politics is quite a weird environment. What tends to happen is that you're sort of people who are standing by the riverbank get thrown into the whitewater rapids, and they're suddenly introduced to an environment that's very difficult and very different, and they get thrown about, and some people knock their heads on the rocks and drown, and some people just get knocked about a bit and then they learn how to engage in that. I then went on to do about 5 years in that environment. We had some great successes, we won a general election, and we lost the referendum campaign. Now, I've just written a book about the EU referendum campaign, and I thought long and hard about doing it, but decided in the end it was better to tell our own story rather than have it told for us. As an aside, anyone who writes a book dreams of being a #1 bestseller, and somebody phoned me up the other day and said, "Do you realise you're #1 bestseller in Britain at the moment?" I said, "Oh no, don't be ridiculous." And they said, "No, go and have a look on Amazon." So sure enough, I looked on Amazon, and next to my name there's a big orange type and it says #1 bestseller. And I clicked on it and it said, "In European Biographical History." Now, I don't know enough about publishing, but I'm guessing that that's not going to trouble J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter too much. But the book is selling quite well. It is also the best-selling book with the word unleashing in the title. I was surprised to see when I sort of typed that into Google that there was a whole category of other books with unleashing in the title, including Unleashing His Tiger and Unleashing His Bear. And there's another one which I won't say, it's too early in the morning. I'm delighted to say the book's doing well and you can buy it in the break. Now, the question I'm asked more than any other one is, why on earth did David Cameron call a referendum? The debate around that question is going to rage down the years. But for those who say that David Cameron could have avoided it, they're denying political reality. A range of factors made it impossible for a Conservative Prime Minister to avoid. Scores of Conservative MPs were rebelling on any and every issue to do with Europe. And they were also amending legislation to ensure that it could actually be brought back to the issue of Europe, even if it was just tangentially related. Many newspapers were full-throated in their demands. UKIP had become a significant force in British politics, not just doing well in the 2014 European elections, but actually winning them. And then there's the so-called democratic deficit. Over half of the population said they wanted a say, and anyone under the age of 60 had never voted on the issue of whether or not we should stay in the EU. Had David Cameron not promised a referendum, the Conservative Party and consequently the country would have become ungovernable. A great boulder would have been placed in the road, impossible to get round and stopping much else being done. In attempting to remove that boulder, David Cameron was well aware that he was risking his job and the fight would be bitter and divisive. I sat with him in the back of his official Jaguar car on the way to a speech in 2015. Those journeys were always a really tight squeeze because the cars are very heavily army plated, and he would try and put his red box, squeeze it between us, which was full of all of his official documents. He ran through all the reasons for holding the referendum. Now, I asked him if he could see the case against, and he said instantly, "Because you could unleash demons of which ye know not." I thought it was a quote from the Bible or Shakespeare, but when I looked it up, I couldn't find it. He'd actually made it up. Those words were truer than he realised. The demons were unleashed, and he and his team faced the reality of dealing with a civil war in the Conservative Party with all the poison and bitterness that comes with it. Can we do the photographs a bit later? Is that okay? Thank you. We also faced the reality of an issue that divided the nation, communities, and families. As well as working out where they stood on the issue, senior politicians were calculating where it would leave their careers in the event of a vote for out. It was a risk and an opportunity for them. For the most part, I don't blame them looking to their careers. David Cameron was always tolerant of people's desire for the big job. After all, he'd wanted it himself once. But it was deeply frustrating. As the Prime Minister renegotiated Britain's deal with Brussels, eventually bringing home something he believed gave us special status in the EU, he constantly lamented the fact that he didn't know where his Home Secretary stood. Theresa May appeared to be flirting with leading the Leave campaign. He predicted it might work for her. She could be Prime Minister in 6 months. She was. One morning, David Cameron and I were on a train on the way to a visit. The Times had reported that she was unhappy about the direction of the renegotiation. David Cameron said, "It's the biggest thing I've faced as Prime Minister, and I don't even know if my own Home Secretary is backing me." Suddenly I was aware he had picked up his mobile phone and was telling her she needed to be clearer in her support for what he was doing. Later that day, she issued a statement that was widely interpreted as her coming down off the fence and supporting Remain. But her support was limited. It was always felt as if she was 51% for Remain and 49% for Leave. A few days after President Obama said Britain should get to the back of the queue in terms of trade negotiations on leaving the EU, Theresa May did another intervention on immigration. She hinted there were serious problems with David Cameron's approach. It was interpreted as a major blow to the Remain campaign, leading Will Straw, who was a director, to say to me in a text, "Back to earth with a bump after Obama. Is May an enemy agent?" Throughout the campaign, she adopted what we called a submarine strategy. She was rarely willing to do media and apparently flirting with Leave when she did. Despite the frustrations of all of this, it's hard to blame her. I think she was sincere in her position, and it can hardly come as a shock to anyone in this room that politicians try to work out how to best position themselves. Amid all the murder and betrayal of the referendum and the subsequent leadership election, one person stood very still at the centre of it all. Theresa May was the last one standing. I can also see where Boris was coming from. He described himself as wobbling all over the place like a wonky shopping trolley. On the morning after we returned from Brussels with a renegotiation deal, I sat in the Prime Minister's office discussing what he was going to tell Cabinet. Suddenly there was a ping on his smartphone. Elbows on knees, glasses perched on the end of his nose, he took a long time to read an email before looking up and saying, "Well, it looks like out." I knew immediately that he meant Boris Johnson. David Cameron read sections of the email describing how depression was setting in and how Boris believed the Leave campaign would fail. 4 hours later, the Prime Minister called to say he had received another email from Boris saying he could still change his mind and back Remain. I was shocked by how open he was being about his doubts. We could have leaked it at any time. We heard nothing more from Boris until 9 minutes before he held a chaotic press conference when he confirmed he was out. In a text just 9 minutes before, he told the Prime Minister he was convinced Brexit would be crushed like a toad beneath the harrow. It was an obscure reference to Kipling poem about how the small can be destroyed by the large. Having understood quite how uncertain Boris was, it was a surprise to see how the Leave campaign turned out, spinning a web of things that weren't true about the EU and Britain's relationship to it. But it would be too easy to say these were the only reasons Remain lost. We certainly made mistakes, and I was part of the team responsible for them. Our campaign was based on the simple proposition that electorates don't vote to make themselves worse off. That view is summed up best in the closest thing to an iron law in politics, James Carville's realisation when running the first Clinton presidential campaign: it's the economy, stupid. The view that the economy would trump immigration as the primary concern of voters was backed up by plenty of solid polling evidence, as well as a pattern of how electorates had behaved going back over a century. It was wrong. And when immigration came to the fore with the realisation that the EU was unprepared to compromise on freedom of movement, many people were outraged we didn't have enough of an answer. As David Cameron told me privately, and this is the crux of everything, we were asking people to vote for an EU they didn't like, and immigration they didn't want. More to the point, we assumed that an army of nearly 3 million people who had become so disengaged and disillusioned that they did not vote in the 2015 general election, and probably sometime before that, would not vote. They did, in numbers large enough to ensure that Leave won. When polled, that group said they did not trust the opinions of politicians, businesses, economists, and experts. It's worth stopping to think about that for a moment. To repeat, a large section of the UK population had stopped trusting anyone in authority. If anything is a risk to political parties, governments, businesses and institutions, it's that simple fact. And we could dedicate the whole morning to how business deals with that. It made that group of people almost unreachable to a campaign arguing for the status quo. That group was highly susceptible to claims of an establishment conspiracy against them, believing politicians had ignored or betrayed them for too long. We realised too late and hadn't done enough to combat it. So I want to show you a few sort of parts of the campaign just to give you a flavour of how it ran and what were both sides thinking. And I think the idea of risk runs through both of them. The Remain campaign was based on the concept of risk. It's been roundly criticised for its doom-laden economic warnings, but the truth is it paid-for media was much more positive. This video that I'm just about to show you aimed to show what families would be losing if we left the EU, and if you could just play it, that would be great.
This is Sam. He's 14 months old. How you vote in the European referendum will shape his future and the future of everyone in our country. If we remain in Europe, there'll be more opportunities for our children to follow their dreams and make the most out of life. Because being in Europe helps our businesses grow and create jobs, giving young people the chance to learn a trade, get into work, and get on in life.
So you get the picture, basically trying to show the positive aspects of the EU, but also the risks for you and your family if you left. Now, while Remain tried to maximise the risk of staying of leaving the EU, Leave maximised the risk of staying. I still find it quite shocking that the following video, which, to be charitable, is completely misleading, was broadcast on all the main TV channels to millions of people. See if you can spot the number of things that are not true in this Leave video. If you could play.
Every week, we send £350 million to Brussels. Money that's wasted. That's enough to build a new hospital every week. It will get worse. The euro is broken, and the EU plans to let in another 5 countries. Imagine what will happen when you're paying for the euro bailouts. Imagine what will happen to public services when Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Turkey join the EU. Imagine our money being spent on our priorities. You can make this happen. This might be our last chance. So, vote Leave on the 23rd of June. Let's take back control.
So it seems clear to me that Leave realised their initial arguments about sovereignty and becoming a free-trading nation like Singapore weren't working. They doubled down on misleading arguments about the risks of immigration. And this is a poster that repeats the claim that Turkey is joining the EU. They wanted people to believe we were going to be overrun by immigrants, despite the fact that no international experts believe Turkey is going to join the EU. Now, this poster wasn't actually from the official Leave campaign, but it did come from the most famous proponent of Leave, Nigel Farage. It was launched just a few hours before the killing of the Labour MP Jo Cox, and when a man was alleged to have shouted "Britain first" before killing her. Even before her killing, it was condemned as racist, with some of the faces changed from white to brown. It also was also a shot of people coming in not under freedom of movement, but asylum seekers on the Slovenia-Croatia border. And this is the most famous thing of all about the Leave campaign, which is leading people to believe that £350 million a week was spent on Brussels, actually not true, and that money could go to the NHS. So you can see that both sides were saying, look, we were saying it's a massive risk if we leave, they were saying it's a massive risk if we stay, and it will cost us money. So where are we now? Britain has voted to leave. If it looks like a confusing mess, it is. Be very suspicious of anyone who tells you they know how this will play out, or that there is a clear path and we just aren't being told what it is. To be clear, Brexit will happen. Lots of people say to me, is there a possibility it won't happen? It will happen. We're leaving the EU. But what that means could change at any time. The best laid plans can be derailed at any stage, as last week's High Court decision revealed. The politics of the situation is understandably bemusing to business. Some see the actions of government as often flying in the face of common sense. Why, they ask, would the government even entertain the idea of hard Brexit, which means leaving the single market and the European Court of Justice, when it's clearly not what's best for the economy and many businesses? The answer is partly that Theresa May believes that is what people voted for, and partly that she needs to limit the threats to her position. For a Prime Minister, that normally means fending off the official opposition. But Theresa May has, rightly in my view, come to the conclusion that the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, is unelectable. This, after all, is a man who refused to sing the national anthem at a memorial service for people who put themselves in flimsy aeroplanes to save the UK from Nazis during the Battle of Britain. There's little more offensive to the British people than that, and those images will haunt him at the next general election, whenever that is. Theresa May's real opposition comes from two corners. Firstly, much of business and Remain MPs who want as soft a Brexit as possible. Secondly, the right wing of the Conservative Party and the popular press who want as hard a Brexit as possible. The question for Theresa May is, can you even begin to square that circle? In the last month, it's looked as if she isn't trying to, favouring a hard Brexit. She believed it's good politics because with a working majority of just 16 in the House of Commons, she feared the right wing of her party would hurt her if she wasn't seen to be singing their song. But she's been made aware that there are obvious downsides to this approach too. Last week's High Court ruling threw a massive spanner in the works. She now faces the possibility that the Remainers in the Conservative Party will join forces with opposition MPs to insist on clarity about the government's negotiating position. They could then force amendments that are designed to soften a hard Brexit. Westminster awaits the result of the appeal to the Supreme Court with bated breath. Things will get interesting if it upholds the decision. In that situation, does Theresa May continue to face down the Remainers, caricaturing them as the unacceptable face of an establishment that is prepared to interfere with the express will of the British people, daring them to get in the way? Or does she call an election? Right now in Downing Street, there will be voices counselling that she go to the country and be bold. They will argue that she would almost certainly win an increased majority and have her own mandate to negotiate how she pleases. Others are counselling caution. They will remind her of the volatility and uncertainty of politics and point to the fact that David Cameron's 2015 victory was an astonishing result. Could she really be sure things wouldn't turn against her? Would all those Lib Dems who voted Tory in 2015 be tempted back in a protest against hard Brexit? Knowing Theresa May as I do, I suspect her instinct is to be cautious. She doesn't like making big moves unless she has to. But she may have to. Years of being held to ransom by your own backbenchers isn't appealing. As I wrote this, the news broke on my phone that Stephen Phillips, a Conservative MP who actually voted out, resigned over the government trying to stop scrutiny by Parliament. In fact, everywhere she turns, she is faced by a rock or a hard place. Take the Conservative Party's conference enthusiasm for hard Brexit earlier this month and how it was one of the triggers for the sharp fall in the value of the pound. It bounced back a little, but only when there was a sense that Brexit might be delayed. The other day, my brother, who's an interior designer, sent me a notice from a leather manufacturer saying that as of January, they are going to raise their prices because of the weakness of the pound. A small but real example of how this country is importing inflation as we speak. There's some truth that the pound was overvalued, but we shouldn't pretend its dramatic fall was anything other than a comment on how expectations for our economy are being downgraded in the face of hard Brexit. No, I'm missing there was a final advert that I was just going to show you, which was basically a massive frog in front of the City of London. And it was basically playing to the idea that the Brits call French frogs and aggressively arguing for banks to relocate. The same is true of others urging American banks to relocate to New York. Needless to say, if parts of them go, it would have a negative impact on the UK economy. To put it in context, financial services provide 10% of the tax take in the UK. It was wonderful news that Nissan is staying in the UK. The car industry is of huge importance to our country. But so too are life sciences. There's the bank thing. This is the La Défense, the French equivalent of the city, trying to urge banks to come over. The car industry is of huge importance to our country, but so too are life sciences, pharmaceuticals and aerospace, or many other sectors. Can we promise them they will get special treatment in the event that we face tariffs for leaving the single market or the customs union? Speaking to people still in government, the result has been a profound split between the three Brexit ministers and the Treasury. Boris Johnson and Liam Fox believe we have nothing to fear but fear itself. They argue there's no reason we shouldn't achieve a deal that is better than our current access to the single market. The former Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg called that delusional. I suspect the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, privately agrees. He is instinctively cautious and fears the complexity of Brexit and the international politics that go along with it. In Cabinet, he openly warns the Brexiteer ministers to be realistic. It seems that there is no way out, the Prime Minister caught between the immovable object of hard Brexiteers and the irresistible force of those who want a softer approach. The answer could be a third way, though. As ever, money talks. The government is quietly floating the idea of hard Brexit and making significant payments to the EU in order to achieve access to the single market. So far, the hardline Brexiteers have not reacted angrily to this suggestion. Remain campaigners find it bitterly ironic, given that the basis of the Leaves campaign was the bogus claim that we should stop paying £350 million a week into the EU in order to funnel it into the NHS. The Brexiteers may be willing to accept this, but will it be acceptable to other countries who have a veto on any deal we do? They see access to the single market with the freedom of movement of goods, capital and services and labour as part of a package that cannot be cherry-picked. Then there's the simple politics of the situation. Next year, France and Germany go to the polls, with Marine Le Pen and Alternative for Deutschland dragging the argument to the right. It's unlikely the candidates for French president or German chancellor will want to be seen as being too soft on the UK. More to the point, it doesn't look great for the rest of the EU if Britain is seen to be doing too well outside of it. The standard retort to all of that claim is that we will be dictating the terms of the negotiations because the EU sells more to the UK than vice versa. The truth is, EU exports to Britain make up 3% of its GDP, whereas British exports to the EU make up 12% of our GDP. So who really has the whip hand in negotiations? If you're bored and frustrated by Brexit, get used to it. It's likely to take up almost the entire bandwidth of the UK government. The next big staging post is the Chancellor's autumn statement, where we'll get a sense of where the Treasury really thinks the UK economy is going. Many see it as signalling hard it's not confident. Then there's a Supreme Court decision and the consequences we discussed on the Brexit timetable. The divorce process of leaving the EU takes 2 years from the moment it's triggered, and only then can trade negotiations with the rest of the world begin. And we all know how long they can take. If it sounds messy and confusing, it is. Donald Rumsfeld famously summed up the complexities of the Iraq War by saying, there are known knowns. These are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we don't know we don't know. When he said it, he gave people a headache working out what on earth he meant. But essentially, he was very profound, I think. He was pointing out we are entering a tremendously uncertain time, a place where things have no guarantees. It's a bit like driving along a long country road at night with no street lamps or headlamps, waiting for gangs to ambush you. In the EU referendum campaign, the Remain side warned leaving was a leap in the dark. We didn't know where we would land. I hope for everyone in the UK we will land in a good place. We won't know if that is the case for several years, and in the short to medium term, we'd better get used to living with volatility, uncertainty, and risk. Thank you very much. And I think that before we go to the panel, that there's an opportunity to ask a few questions. So please don't hold back. Please feel free to ask whatever you like. Nobody ever wants to at the beginning, do they? So here's one.
Well, sadly for the audience, Craig, I'll be on the panel as well. My view is that the one point I agree with you on is that there's a crisis of authority. But you have to bear in mind that, it's the authors that create authority, and the public have just spoken that they wish to be the authors of their own destiny. And I think where you then go awry is by looking at your adverts and say, look, this led people to believe. Nobody's leading anybody if there's a crisis of authority. What really happened is that despite every major party political leader telling people to vote Remain, despite Obama, despite Christine Lagarde, despite Mark Carney, despite everybody else, and despite a terrible Leave choice, because nobody really rated Boris or Nigel, despite all of that, the biggest majority this country's ever seen voted to leave. And I think that's the bit that you need to get your head around, because, despite being told by all the great and the good, the fact that most of the people of this country who voted said, we want out, should try and point to a different lesson for you. They were not led. They were not. When you talk about lies, you need to understand that what you're really saying.
Is there a question coming?
Yeah. Well, okay. When you talk about lies, here's the question. In all honesty, do you think it's a good idea to talk about people were lied to? Because what you're really saying is that people are too silly to see through the lies.
I'm not saying that people are too silly, and I also didn't say that. People made their choice, and I'm totally accept that the choice of that, and I totally accept that. And I think you've totally misunderstood what I'm saying if you think that I'm not accepting the choice. I also made very, very clear that the Remain campaign made a lot of mistakes. I made the point in my speech that we didn't pay enough attention to people who hadn't voted, to people who felt they were disengaged. I made all those points. I accept that. I agree with you. I think where we're probably disagreeing is what I'm just simply saying is if you have a campaign, what were the 4 main planks of the Leave campaign? That we spend £350 million a week on the EU, not actually the true figure, and the idea that money can just be funneled into the NHS. Not true. There is going to be an EU army and Britain will be forced to join it. Not true. Turkey is going to join the EU, and those other 4 countries are going to join. Not true. And also that all our sovereignty is somehow passed over to Strasbourg and Luxembourg and Brussels, and that we don't take decisions on tax, security and defence, health, education, welfare. All of those things were said, that they weren't true. Now, I am just simply saying that we have gone through a campaign where I think that the debate was not handled brilliantly by both sides, where we made mistakes, but I certainly think it is also true that people were misled. And I think that one of the things that we should look at from this campaign is what happens when people are told things repeatedly by people in authority, and the Leave campaign had people in authority too, that are not the case. It's not a great situation to be in. And I think, to be honest, I'm a bit disappointed that you come at me so aggressively in that way, because I don't think you're really listening to what I was saying, and you're really actually fighting the campaign again, rather than listening to somebody who actually accepts that we made some mistakes.
Craig, not necessarily Brexit related, but do you think it's ever okay to break the rules?
Do I think it's ever okay? Oh, that's a big question. On balance, I will stick with what I would say to my children, which is no. It's not a good idea to break the rules, no. Why are you asking that? What's behind that question?
So I work in risk management, and I was thinking about do governments have the same approach that institutions and corporations take to risk management? Why do governments and agencies and ministries also have a function that performs for risk wrong?
So you're saying that if the rule is wrong and it's clearly wrong and it's clearly a problem, should you not deal with it? You have to use the mechanisms which are lobbying governments, talking to people, making very clear why there's a problem for your industry, and powerfully making the case and hoping that will make a difference. But no, I mean, it's never a great idea to sort of break the law. There lies anarchy, I'm afraid. Any more questions?
Yes, Gerhard from Unisys. Was interesting to hear you reading your presentation. Now, with regard to some of the things that you have said, I think some things that appear negative, actually quite positive, like the governor of the Bank of England hoping that we have some extra inflation. Now we are getting some increased inflation. We should all be cheering. The pound has gone down. It's something that Italy, Greece, and all the southern Europeans would give their right hand for. Also a very good thing for our exports. So many things that did happen ever since are actually quite positive, even those things that have been projected as something that is a negative thing to come. So does it look now that Brexit actually was a good thing after all?
Look, you're certainly right that there are lots of areas where you could point to and say, look, this works really well for this particular area or that particular area. And you're certainly right that for business, there will definitely be massive opportunities for a lot of businesses in terms of Brexit. And I wouldn't pretend that isn't the case. And what needs to happen is that we need to find ways of dealing with that. But we shouldn't deny that there are a lot of problems. You know, the European Union is our biggest market. If we don't have the ease of access that we have to it now, that is going to present problems too. People who are far better at economics than me tell me, yes, of course there are benefits to exporters of, you know, the pound going down. But the problems of that outweigh it. You know, trying to go abroad if you're going on holiday, trying to import goods, importing inflation, what impact is that going to have on the economy? And the fundamental question is, when the pound goes down to that extent, yes, to some extent it was overvalued, but when it goes down to that extent, is that a vote of confidence in the British economy or not? And the truth is that most people see it as not being a vote of confidence in the British economy. So yes, you can point to things that are positives, but I would say overall it's not a great sign. But yes, some sectors will find some opportunities in that. Sorry, there was somebody here on this table here.
Sorry, I was given the mic first, so I'll ask my question. You gave a good idea of the sort of momentum of the campaign and the pressures that were going on behind the campaign at the time. But after the campaign, obviously lots has happened.
Yes.
But someone somewhere looking at the reason that people felt that resentment of authority, and whether that should affect economic policy in the future, and how do you think it might affect economic policy in the future?
Again, that's a massive question. I think every political party in this country, if it's doing its job properly, will basically be looking at the result of the referendum and the message that was sent back to authority, not just in terms of government, but I think also in terms of business. There was a YouGov poll that was done in the middle of the referendum campaign. And they did that thing where they went through every sort of aspect of society and said, who do you trust? And there were huge numbers of people saying, we don't trust any of these people. Now, that is a big question if you are a business which is trying to interact with a community. It's a big question for a political party if you're trying to get elected. What I would not pretend that lots of people have answers, but clearly people feel that something has gone wrong in the way that politics is conducted in this country, the way it's reported, and the way people feel about how they've been treated. And anybody who has the answer to that question is going to be a very rich person, I suspect. But yes, everybody's looking at it. Political parties will be, I'm sure businesses are as well, because it's a deep concern to them too. Sorry, you were...
Hi, Paul Skiro. Trying to bring this sort of back to where we are today. There's a room full of people who are on a daily basis trying to influence people. And I'm just thinking, what are the 2 or 3 key lessons that you can share with us that you've learned from the Brexit campaign on influencing people?
On influencing what, in government or the electorates?
Just generally influencing people.
Well, look, I mean, I think that as what I found during the referendum campaign was that we struggled to get business to talk with one voice. And that it was very difficult when lots of businesses were saying to us privately, we're deeply, deeply concerned about this, but we're worried about going out there and speaking there because we know we're going to offend half of the people, or that we're going to say things that are going to be deeply controversial and wind people up and make people unhappy. But what I would say is, if you want to influence government and if you want to influence people, you need to work together across your sectors and then probably across industry as well, and work together, because at the moment what's happened is the government is announcing that it's going to do it sector by sector, and my experience of government is the squeaky wheel gets the attention. So Nissan were right at the front of the queue because they were making a decision about whether the Qashqai car was actually going to be built in Britain. That was going to be a huge influence on jobs and the economy of the Northeast, and government needed to deal with that problem because it went straight to the top of their in-tray, and Nissan was obviously an issue that needed to be properly dealt with. Now, other sectors need to find ways of talking to government, to Greg Clark, to Philip Hammond, to Theresa May, and say, look, this is why my sector matters, and this is why if you behave in this way, it will make a huge difference to my industry. And finding ways to demonstrate that, to campaign, to talk to them is absolutely crucial. So I would spend a lot of time thinking about, what is your message? Is it reasonable and sensible and clear? And are you actually articulating it to the key departments and key people to make sure that's clear? In terms of the public, I think that is a much bigger question for industry, politics, corporations, that kind of thing, is how are we seen? Are we seen post-2008 as just people who are just trying to ravage people, take all their money and that kind of thing? And how do we show that business is massively important in terms of jobs, community, emphasising those aspects? But it's a big issue, a big problem, and it's not something that's going to be solved in a few weeks, I'm afraid.
Okay, let's take a break here just for 2 minutes, and we'll bring our panelists up on the stage. And Sir Craig, if you'll join the panel as well. For those of you who have seen some of the debate, I actually wore a Kevlar vest today. I'm the moderator, and I'll be in the middle. Let's just, if other panelists will join us up here.